Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to look at long-run aggregate supply. So long-run aggregate supply is the amount of goods and services, real GDP, that firms are willing and able to produce in the long run at different price levels. And as you look at the definition of LRAS, you'll notice that it's basically the same definition as short-run aggregate supply. The only difference here is that we're talking about the long run and not the short run. So the general idea is the same, that we're talking about how many goods and services can be produced. It's all about the production here, but we're looking at the long run, not the short run. So what really is the difference besides the names between short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply? Well, the first major difference is how we draw long run aggregate supply. So the labels here are still going to be real GDP or Y and the price level or PL. Now, in terms of drawing it, you may be surprised to learn that long-run aggregate supply is actually perfectly inelastic. It's a vertical line, LRAS. So you can see that it has a very different shape than a short-run aggregate supply that would be upward sloping. And we notice here that there's a relationship, a very different relationship between the price level and real GDP as reflected with long-run aggregate supply. And so we can spell that relationship out here, that regardless of whether the price level increases or decreases, real GDP supplied doesn't change in the long run. Doesn't matter if we have inflation or deflation, real GDP is not going to change in the long run. It's going to stay right where it is. And so that's a really different relationship than with short-run aggregate supply, where if the price level changed, real GDP supplied would change in the same direction. And the question is why? What explains this relationship with long-run aggregate supply? And the answer, just like with its short-run counterpart, is sticky wages. So LRAS is vertical because wages and other resource prices are flexible in the long run and will change as fast as the price of goods and services, giving firms no incentive to produce more output when the price level increases, since the price of their product will increase by the same percentage as the price of their resources. In other words, if we go back to the formula for profit equals total revenue minus total cost, we know that total revenue is essentially the price of your product times how much you're producing. And so let's say there's inflation. Well, we know that the price is going to increase, and so total revenue is going to increase. We know that total cost is made up of the cost of resources, right? And so we know that there's going to be an increase in total cost as well. In the short run, the increase in total revenue would be greater than the increase in total cost, because the price of my product is going to increase by a greater percentage than the price of my resources. But in the long run, the percent change is the same for both total revenue and total cost. So for example, if total revenue increases by 20% and total cost also increases by 20%, then the change in profit is zero. There's no change in profit. And so you can see that firms have no incentive to change how much they're producing, whether there's inflation or deflation, because it's not going to have any impact on their profit. They're still going to be making the same amount of money. So in the short run, because resource prices are sticky, there is an incentive for firms to change their production level when the price level changes. But in the long run, that incentive doesn't exist. With that in mind, what I want to do now is talk about what would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. And you may have noticed in the last video, I did not mention what would move the short-run aggregate supply curve. And the reason is because the same things that move the short-run aggregate supply curve will also move the long-run aggregate supply curve. And students sometimes get a little nervous about this because they say, okay, well, Mr. Schmidt, on an AP question, like a multiple choice question, what happens if they tell me, they give me a scenario and it could move short run or long run to the right, as an example. Which one would I pick? And the answer is AP is never going to put you in that position where you're going to have to pick between the two curves. You'll never ever have to do that. So as long as you know that these things move aggregate supply, whether it's short run or long run, left or right, you'll be fine. So the first one is very similar with market supply, change in production costs. If it's more expensive to produce, you don't make as much. If it's less expensive to produce, you make more. Government action here, so this is different than government spending per se. If there's a government action that makes it less likely for firms to produce, say a tax on businesses, then that's going to shift SRAS or LRAS to the left. And if there's something that encourages production, like a subsidy, it would move those curves to the right. And then finally, if there's a change in resource quantity or quality, that'll move SRAS, LRAS left if the resources are bad or less. And if they're better or there's more of them, it will move SRAS or LRAS to the right. Now, this last one here may seem a little familiar to you because this also is what would move the production possibilities curve left or right. And so I want you to be thinking about that connection because LRAS and the production possibilities curve are basically the same curve. LRAS, long run aggregate supply, not short run, long run aggregate supply is a nation's production possibilities curve. It represents maximum, what we would call maximum sustainable. Okay, sorry guys, I can write that neater. I'm sorry. Let's do that again. Maximum, get ahead of my writing here. Maximum sustainable capacity. So maximum means the most, capacity, how much you can produce. Sustainable here means what the economy could do at one time without overheating. And you'll see what I mean by overheating in another video. But the point is, I'll just kind of tease it out here, is that an economy actually can produce beyond its PPC. If you remember back in Unit 1 when I said, okay, here's the PPC and a point outside the curve is unattainable, what I really meant to say there is it's unsustainable. It can't be sustained over longer periods of time. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how that works when we get into some future units. But the point you need to understand here is that short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply, okay, are two separate curves, but long-run aggregate supply and the PPC are the same curve effectively. So just make sure you understand that, and they both can shift in the same direction based on what happens. And so a right shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve means economic growth, and a left shift of the PPC would mean economic decline for the country. Same thing, I could swap that out. I can use LRAS, PPC interchangeably to mean the same thing here. So just equate those two curves in your mind. LRAS, PPC, PPC, same curve. One last thing, and then we'll wrap up this video. Back to the curve shifts. The one thing that will not shift either SRAS or LRAS would be a change in price level. A change in price level will not shift SRAS or LRAS. So that's all for this video on the long run aggregate supply curve. Until next time, have a great day.